Mr. President.
Senator from New Hampshire.
Mr. President, I come to the floor today in support of Senate Joint Resolution 10, which would terminate the misguided national energy emergency that President Trump signed on his first day in office. It has been 37 days since President Trump declared, for the first time in this nation's history, a national energy emergency. This is an attempt to throw red meat to the base of the Republican Party and to seem like Donald Trump is the oil and gas president. But there's no evidence to support that. In fact, the evidence we have points in exactly the opposite direction. This emergency was declared despite the fact that the United States is producing more oil than any other country ever in this nation's history. And we've been doing that for the past 7 years. The emergency was declared despite the fact that the United States is in the midst of a clean energy boom and a manufacturing renaissance. We generated 17% more electricity in 2023 than the high point of the first Trump administration. Clean energy jobs are growing at twice the rate of the economy overall. And this emergency was declared despite the fact that, as the Wall Street Journal headline noted after the election, quote, Trump's oil and gas donors don't really want to drill, baby, drill, end quote. They are very happy to lock in demand for the long term, but increase supply and potentially undercut profits. Not so much. So we find ourselves with an emergency declaration in search of an emergency. But it's not without consequences. President Trump has assumed vast power for the executive branch through this emergency designation. He's encouraging the use of eminent domain that could literally allow the government to take your land away. He's waving away key protections for clean water. And he's suggesting that a timeline of just 7 days is sufficient for public comment, on projects that could cause irreparable harm to historic and cultural resources. President Trump campaigned on, and I'm quoting here, lowering the cost of everything. And he promised, your energy bill within 12 months will be cut in half. Now, voters responded to those promises, and Americans do want to see lower energy costs. I'm all for that. I focused as governor on how we could address the high energy prices in New Hampshire. We permitted 2 gas pipelines through the state, both gas coming from Canada. And we negotiated a deal with our largest utility company that lowered rates 16.5%. So I'm all for lowering energy costs. We absolutely should be talking about that. But let's take a step back here, and let's talk about what President Trump's energy policies actually are and how they affect the American people. In the first 37 days, we've seen the Trump administration cut off funding for solar, wind, and clean manufacturing projects that are cheaper and faster to build than fossil fuel infrastructure. We've seen him halt energy efficiency programs, and we know energy efficiency is the cheapest, fastest way to deal with our energy needs. He's prepared a 10% energy tax in the form of tariffs on heating oil, propane, gasoline, and other energy we import from Canada. And that hits New Hampshire really hard because of the energy sources we get from Canada. I talked about the 2 gas pipelines that come down from Canada. And because we have so many households that burn number 2 fuel oil to heat our homes, and because it's cold in New Hampshire at this time of year. So that hits us really hard. He's fired more than 1,000 workers at the Department of Energy, including those who are keeping state energy programs and weatherization up and running to respond to emergencies and to help folks like we have in New Hampshire stay warm this winter. And tomorrow, What we expect is that Senate Republicans will roll back a common sense fee on venting or flaring of methane rather than capturing it for productive use. And if that passes and the president signs it, it will cost the taxpayers $2.3 billion over the next 10 years, effectively lighting money on fire to save big oil a few bucks. Now, in New Hampshire, as in other states, President Trump's actions have sown chaos and uncertainty. They're raising costs for families, for farmers, for small businesses, and for town budgets. For example, the tariffs that are set to go into effect, and I understand that the president has now decided he's going to wait until April, but they could mean about $150 to $250 more for the average family in New Hampshire who are using heating oil just to keep warm through the winter. President Trump's efforts to cancel promised funding for electric charging infrastructure in New Hampshire harms our travel and tourism sector, particularly in northern New Hampshire, where ski areas and other outdoor recreation drive our local economies. A recent study found that the state risks losing an estimated $1.4 billion in overall economic impact if we don't build up our charging infrastructure. One small business owner in Barrington, in the seacoast of New Hampshire, told me that he has nearly $3 million in projects. Those projects are on hold this year, including work with school districts, with the state, and with other customers to install solar projects that provide long-term taxpayer savings. And they're on hold because of what President Trump has ordered. Farms and local shops across rural areas of New Hampshire are nervous about receiving promised reimbursements for energy-saving work through the Rural Energy for America program, the REAP program. At least one business owner at Seacoast Power Equipment has been covering interest with the bank until his grant, which he has a signed commitment for, is actually paid out. And of course, this is affecting his bottom line. And then we have super secret ice cream in Bethlehem, New Hampshire, in the northern part of our state. This is an award-winning small business that provides the best ice cream you've ever eaten. They were gearing up to install solar panels using $15,000 in federal funds. Now that project is on hold. Many family-owned businesses, like Super Secret Ice Cream, have very tight margins, and this small investment of $15,000 would help Christina and Dan grow their business and lower the electric costs that they're paying to store their ice cream. And then we have the town of Peterborough in the western part of New Hampshire. They plan to use funding from the bipartisan infrastructure law to enhance much-needed workforce development. But, of course, they've had to wait far too long for federal approvals. And in rural towns like Berlin in the northern part of our state, residents eagerly signed up for federally funded projects that will insulate and add solar arrays to their manufactured homes. This is a real solution to their high utility bills. But these projects are now on hold because the contractors are uncertain that they're going to be paid. Now, I could go on, as I know my colleagues could, but since we have people waiting, I want to close with a point of agreement. In his executive order, President Trump stated, and I quote, "We need a reliable, diversified, and affordable supply of energy to drive our nation's manufacturing, transportation, agriculture, and defense industries, and to sustain the basics of modern life and military preparedness." That makes sense to me. I agree with that. But unfortunately, that's about the only thing he said related to energy in the past 37 days that does make sense. Lowering energy costs, creating good jobs, increasing America's economic competitiveness in the world, those ought to be things that we can all agree on. But if we give up our leadership on clean energy now, the People's Republic of China, who President Trump claims is our greatest competitor, and I agree with him on that. I just don't understand how the Trump administration policies are allowing us to be competitive. But China is going to be more than happy to fill the void for its own economic advantage. I think we should also agree that Americans deserve clean air, clean water, and the chance to have a say in what happens in their communities. I want to work with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle on these goals. And that work starts by ending this disastrous, misguided emergency declaration and by stopping the chaos. So I hope my colleagues will join me in voting to restore Congress' appropriate role in setting energy policies that benefit the American people by supporting this resolution. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Senator from Rhode Island.
I'm here to join my colleagues in objecting to President Trump's fake energy emergency, which is part of the Trump continuing strategy to hurt families and help billionaires. In this case, the fossil fuel billionaires who put at least $100 million into getting him elected, probably a good deal more because so much of the money was dark money, we don't know, but there's every reason to believe that it was multiple hundreds of millions of dollars spent to get him elected, and it's payback time for the big donors and tough bounce to the families whose bills are going to go up as a result. How are families' bills going to go up? Well, for starters, renewables are less expensive than fossil fuel. And when you add them to the mix, the grid runs on a queue, and it takes the cheapest sources and puts them in the line. And as you demand more and more electricity, you finally get to the more expensive energy sources. And inexpensive renewables coming in drives out the expensive fossil fuel from the top, and it lowers energy costs overall. So when you stop doing that, the most expensive plants have to come back online, and that will raise utility bills. But most importantly to Trump, profits for fossil fuel billionaires. We make ourselves with this more vulnerable to the OPEC fossil fuel cartel, the oil and gas cartel. They raise prices by manipulating international markets. The American oil and gas companies follow up, even if they don't need to make that much money. They will follow the OPEC prices. As a result, they have declared the biggest profits in the history of humankind at the expense of American families, both at the fuel pump and at home and on their electric bills. Doesn't matter to this administration. It's a win for the fossil fuel billionaires who paid good money to get this administration in, and families will be hurt to help the fossil fuel billionaires. Another one is LNG export. What happens in the liquefied natural gas market when you take our natural gas, liquefy it, send it offshore someplace else? It doesn't go into the pipelines here in America. It pinches the supply available to Americans, which raises prices for Americans, unless you want to repeal the economic laws of supply and demand. So over and over and over again, these pro-fossil fuel mega donor policies hurt American families, raise family electric utility bills, and provide huge benefits back to the big donors who spent good money to get them into office. Who gets hit the most when you attack solar and attack wind power? Well, here are the top solar states by installed capacity. You start with California, obviously, it's the 5th biggest economy in the world, but the next 4 are Texas, Florida, North Carolina, and Arizona. There's a lot of red voters in those states who are going to pay the price of this bad policy. You look over to wind, top state, Texas. Next, Iowa. Next, Oklahoma. Next, Kansas. Again, red states will pay the price for this donor-oriented policy. The Trump administration doesn't even concede that solar and wind power are energy. When they use the word energy, they only mean fossil and nuclear. They have literally defined solar and wind out of the energy mix by process of vocabulary magic. So we're headed for a bad place, and consumers are going to pay, all to make big fossil fuel barons even richer than they are. And the shame here is that there actually is an emergency out there. There actually is an energy emergency out there. And the energy emergency is happening because fossil fuel emissions are changing the weather and the natural systems of the Earth so that risk of weather disasters, whether it's wildfire or flooding, is getting so bad that property insurers can't keep up. So we are having a crisis in property insurance markets. It is fully developed in Florida. California is not far behind. And what the chief economist for our mortgage giant Freddie Mac has warned of is that the property insurance crisis morphs into a mortgage crisis, because if you can't get property insurance on a property, guess what else you can't get on that property? You can't get a mortgage on it. And the mortgage crisis devolves into a property values crash, because if you can't find buyers because nobody can get a mortgage on that property, your property value just collapsed. And then that morphs into a nationwide economic crash on the scale of 2008. That's what they said just about coastal property values. Now we've got the wildfire risk coming along side by side, the evil sibling. So is there an emergency? Yes, it is coming on. And it's coming on soon enough that the Fed chair, in testimony just over a week ago here in the Senate, said, after a decade goes by, there will be regions of the United States of America where you can't even get a mortgage any longer. What's that going to do to property values and people's homes? And by the way, if that's the case for 10 years out, markets are going to start to move sooner. So this is a problem that is on us now. We have a real emergency coming. It is going to clobber us economically. Our friends on the Republican side don't want to listen to us because of all the fossil fuel money that goes into their party. The president doesn't want to listen to it because he got paid so many hundreds of millions of dollars in political funds to get himself elected. But nature's rules can't be repealed by man. This is coming on. We ought to be prepared for it. With that, I yield.
Mr. President.
The senator from Connecticut.
Mr. President, I'm pleased to follow my colleague and friend from Rhode Island and join with the senator from Virginia, Senator Kaine, in supporting Senate Resolution 10, which is a joint resolution to terminate President Trump's illegal executive order declaring an energy emergency. And it's not only nature's rule that is being violated, as Senator Whitehouse just said so eloquently, it's also this Congress's rule. In effect, the President is flouting and defying this Congress, this independent, separate body of the United States government, in the money that has already been appropriated for projects that will help avoid an energy emergency in the future and reduce the prices of energy for American families. And to the families of America, let's just be very clear. President Trump is illegally withholding appropriated funding for projects in your communities and your neighborhoods. Not only projects to increase energy efficiency, but also to strengthen the electrical grid that brings electricity into your home. Projects to build out America's clean energy infrastructure that will avoid pollution in your neighborhoods. This funding freeze sweeps a range of programs having nothing to do with unleashing American energy, whatever President Trump thinks it is. We're talking about funding for clean drinking water projects that will enable better drinking water for your homes, and brownfields remediation so that businesses can be developed in places that now are polluted, heating assistance for low-income households during the end of this winter, and causing confusion and consternation across the country. But make no mistake, if this funding is withheld, the projects and the needs and the challenges don't go away. There will still be a need to clean up those brownfields, to deliver through the electric grid, to make energy efficiency real in communities and neighborhoods. But you will pay. Your taxes will be increased at the state level and the local level. And those projects will become more expensive. So there's a double and triple whammy here. Increase the costs now and in the future for projects that are absolutely essential to the health as well as energy efficiency of our country. Republicans say they're for an all-of-the-above approach to energy, but then they turn around and they attack renewables. They say that they are for cleaning up brownfields, but then they support this kind of executive order that is illegal and also stymies or stops those brownfields remediation. Like all of the actions by executive order President Trump has taken in his first month of office, it isn't actually solving a problem, it is exacerbating it. It's lining the pockets of billionaire buddies, in this case, oil and gas executives, at the expense of everyday Americans. And if there is an energy emergency, it will be created by President Trump. It won't be solved by him, and congressional Republicans will be complicit in it. There's also an effect on jobs. In fact, thousands of jobs are threatened by this executive order. Repealing the Inflation Reduction Act by executive edict threatens 400,000 new jobs that have been announced since August of 2022. Connecticut alone has around 50,000 workers in the clean energy sector. All of those jobs are at risk. They are threatened by President Trump's attack on the industry. And to my colleagues across the aisle, make no mistake, this is going to affect your constituents as well. Studies have found that a majority of clean energy products, clean energy jobs created during the first full year after the Inflation Reduction Act passed actually were in the South, in Republican states. Jobs in clean energy are not in one state or just blue states. They are across the country. 8 out of 10 congressional districts that received the most funding under these laws were represented by Republicans. It shouldn't be a partisan issue. It is, as we say all the time, an American issue. We stand ready to work with anyone who wants to lower costs for consumers and support domestic energy production by building on the historic investments made by the Infrastructure and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. But President Trump's order in no way helps. It simply harms that effort. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on this resolution, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Senator from Colorado.
the United States is in an energy boom. Our nation has never produced more electricity, oil, and gas than we are producing right now. This all-of-the-above approach to energy, using everything, including solar, wind, geothermal, is keeping energy prices as low as possible for working families, but at the same time recognizing that climate change is real and moving towards a clean energy future. Excluding coal, the U.S. produced more energy than any other country in the history of the world in 2023. It appears that some in this administration are determined to undo that progress, despite American leadership in energy, the President signed an executive order on his first day declaring a national energy emergency. That sounds dramatic, almost theatrical, because it's meant to be. Let's call this political theater for what it is, an attempt to accelerate oil and gas projects while at the same time holding back our renewable energy. Of course, there are things that we need to be doing to keep energy cleaner, prices lower, and to cement American energy independence. For starters, we need to increase energy production. We need to meet our energy future by streamlining permitting of our new energy projects, of all our energy projects, while at the same time being mindful about the environmental impacts and giving impacted communities a public forum. We need to upgrade our grid. We need to increase clean, domestic, critical mineral production. But that's not what this executive order will do. In fact, it won't do a single one of these things. They claim we're in an emergency, an energy emergency, but they continue to block federal wind and energy permits. They claim we're in an emergency, an energy emergency, but then they ship oil and gas overseas. The claim is we're in an energy emergency, and yet their actions would cede complete control of what eventually will be an enormous global market in renewable energy to China. The administration has also fired thousands of government workers who play vital roles in American energy, all in the name of government efficiency and giving tax cuts to the ultra-wealthy. Listen, I'm all for making government more efficient. I've worked on that most of my public life. If you want to seriously look at how we spend money and where we can actually cut fraud, waste, and abuse, I'm game. But hastily, almost randomly firing Department of Energy employees or letting go 300 workers who maintain our nuclear security and safety, I don't think that's the way to do it. Our office has even heard from a private company that is worried that the federal employee responsible for managing their permitting process is about to be fired, placing the entire success of their project at risk. They help bring energy to our local communities. This will stop them dead in their tracks and raise prices for households at the same time. America's energy economy is booming, in large part because of the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act, bills that make historic investments in American-made energy. These bills have created more than 400,000 good-paying jobs. And yet there's an effort by some in the Congress, mostly Republicans, I should say all Republicans, and the administration, but that effort is to slash and impede the progress that we've made. Even though an estimated 70% of the benefits, the jobs, the investments, the increased energy, are going to red states. Cutting funding from these critical pieces of legislation is going to hit our rural communities the hardest, where it could provide the greatest benefit. It'll shrink county government revenue, it will force layoffs, and ultimately it will increase the cost of energy. Clean energy isn't just some liberal boogeyman, it's not some notion. In fact, most of the energy that's ready to go as we expand our capacity, it's ready to go, is clean and affordable. Solar, wind, storage, they make up 95% of the capacity of new energy ready to connect to our grid. Wind generates 10% of our electricity now and will provide much more affordable renewable energy if more permits were made available. Withholding funds already appropriated by Congress through these laws, if these funds are withheld, energy bills can balloon by up to 12% for American families. That's at least $240 a year for working families that they'll have to come up with one way or another. And certainly when you're struggling to afford eggs at the grocery store, trying to balance your checkbook at the end of the month, the last thing you need is an increase in your energy bill. Some in Congress, some Republicans have introduced their budget which strips critical services for Coloradans while adding $4 trillion to our national debt, all primarily so they can give tax breaks, of which more than half go to the ultra-wealthy, who, at least many in Colorado, don't even want them. I put an amendment on the floor that would strip any provision from their budget that would raise energy costs for Americans. Now, how can people be opposed to that, and yet every Republican voted against it? I think they're putting politics over people. We're able to keep energy prices low for working families because we use everything: oil, gas, geothermal, wind. So rather than limiting energy sources, proclaiming a false emergency, or firing critical government employees, let's meet the moment and usher in a new energy future that helps everyone. A future marked by a resilient energy grid built by American innovation that delivers low-cost, reliable energy for every Coloradan, for every American. If this administration is looking for a bipartisan roadmap on this, we have one. We should pass permitting reform that streamlines review for all energy projects, not just oil and gas. We can build a modern electric grid that will reduce energy prices for all. Let's continue supporting emerging technologies like advanced geothermal and nuclear so that we can remain dominant in the markets that are emerging. And let's stop picking winners and losers. The vast majority of new electricity is coming from low-cost solar, wind, and energy storage. Let's follow the law and let the investments in energy from the past few years go to the communities that need them. Let's cut the nonsense. This isn't an energy emergency, it's an energy opportunity. This administration's actions certainly would cause an emergency for many Colorado and American working families. Mr. President, I yield back the floor.
President.
The senator from Connecticut?
From Maryland.
Maryland, excuse me.
That's okay. Thank you, Mr. President. I want to start by thanking my colleague from across the Potomac River, Senator Kane of Virginia, and also Senator Heinrich of New Mexico for bringing this resolution before the United States Senate. And Mr. President, we are now witnessing in real time two of the most corrupt bargains in American history. One of those corrupt bargains is the one that President Trump made with Elon Musk. Elon Musk spent $280 million to help elect Donald Trump, President of the United States. $280 million. And President Trump has handed the keys of federal agencies over to Elon Musk. He even appeared at the cabinet meeting today with other members of the cabinet that went through the advice and consent process in the United States Senate. Elon Musk didn't do that, but he did spend $280 million to help elect President Trump. And now, the actions that Elon Musk is taking are designed to rig government agencies to do the bidding of people like Elon Musk and other billionaires. In fact, we've been reading more and more about the billions of dollars of federal contracts that Elon Musk has gotten, and more to come. Just within the last 48 hours, we're talking about an FAA contract for Starlink. This has nothing to do with government efficiency. If it were, you would not start by firing all the inspector generals across the United States government, whose job it is to look out for waste, fraud, and abuse. And in fact, what you would do when you get rid of the inspector generals is open the door to waste, fraud, and abuse. So we should be on full alert here in the United States Senate as to what's happening. As others have said, we're also watching them claim to make savings, which actually they've had to change their sort of tally board every day because of misrepresentations. But they do want to clear the way to provide tax cuts to very, very wealthy people like Elon Musk at the expense of everybody else in America. And of course, the House just passed a budget resolution to set up that process last night. So that's one corrupt bargain that's playing out right now, and thousands of patriotic federal employees around the country who do the people's work are being fired based on lies. And I say lies because they're claiming that they're firing them based on performance, only to find out that these federal employees are coming forward with glowing performance reports as part of their most recent assessments. So that was a lie because that was the standard that had to be met, even if they had to make it up. And all these cases are now finding their ways through the courts. We have over 60 court proceedings. Many federal judges have issued temporary restraining orders to put a halt to this rampage of illegal activity. The other corrupt bargain is the one that brings us to the Senate floor today, because it was in May of last year during the campaign that candidate Trump promised the big oil executives that he would deliver their wish list if they spent $1 billion to return him to the White House. So much has happened since then, I think some people forget, but here's the Washington Post headline from May 9th, 2024. What Trump promised oil CEOs as he asked them to steer $1 billion to his campaign. The story describes how the CEOs there were stunned when he went on to say, "You are all wealthy enough that you should raise $1 billion to return me to the White House." And he vowed to immediately reverse dozens of President Biden's rules and policies. And as the article indicates, among the things he promised to scrap were the efforts to develop more clean vehicles, more electric vehicles, and to develop more wind energy. So he promised to provide more opportunities for the big oil companies while harming their competitors in the clean energy industry. Now, he promised he would do all this on day one. He also made another promise as to what he would do on day one. He promised the American people he was going to lower prices on day one. Well, Mr. President, we all know that that's just not happening. Prices are going up. Grocery prices are going up. Rents are going up. Home prices are going up. Price of eggs are through the roof. So President Trump is not delivering on that day one promise. He is delivering on his promise to the big oil executives to issue that order that has made it even easier for them to produce when they're already producing close to maximum current levels. In fact, as my colleagues have said, for the past 6 years in a row, the United States has been producing more crude oil than any other nation at any other time ever. In fact, the last administration actually approved more oil and gas leases during those 4 years than Donald Trump did during his first term in the White House. And there's plenty of room to grow under existing leases. About half of U.S. oil and gas leases are currently not being used. So here he issues an executive order to allow even more to move forward, even when a lot of potential is still not being tapped, but doing it in a way that will negatively impact the public health, sacrifice clean air and clean water. But Mr. President, that's only half the problem. That's half the problem. Because what President Trump is doing is not only giving a blank check to the big oil companies, he's also sabotaging clean energy in the United States of America. They, of course, provide competition to the big oil companies. So by throttling and sabotaging efforts when it comes to solar power or wind power or electric vehicles, you're actually producing less overall energy. You're actually giving the big oil companies a competitive advantage. That means prices go up, not down. I can tell you that in my state of Maryland, people are feeling the impact of higher electricity prices. We need to generate more electricity. We've got data centers coming on board. AI consumes a lot of energy. So why in the world would President Trump be trying to cripple the clean energy industry? Well, that's what he told the big oil executives he would do. He's going to crack down on wind power. Well, I will tell you that solar and wind energy are among the cheapest forms of energy in the country. And at a time when American pocketbooks are tight, renewable energy will help keep energy bills down. In fact, renewable energy is expected to save Americans $38 billion on electricity bills by the year 2030 and produce more than 350,000 jobs in America. So why is President Trump trying to sabotage bringing that additional energy onto the grid and to Americans? Mr. President, in Maryland, we're planning investments in offshore wind that will create 2,600 local jobs and power over 718,000 homes. That's wind power energy. That's what Donald Trump is trying to sabotage. So if you really want to create more energy and you want to reduce energy prices, you wouldn't be doing what Donald Trump is doing when it comes to putting the screws to clean energy production. Mr. President, I do want to mention one other way in which this is going to really harm America's interests. And that is, it's going to open the door even wider to our adversaries who are competing in this space, principally China. You know, we spent a lot of time trying to improve our supply chains, develop a supply chains for clear minerals that we need to develop electric vehicles. And by sabotaging this sector, we are opening the door to China just to run into this market and leave us behind. That is not America first. That is America in retreat, just as it's American retreat for us to vote with Russia and North Korea at the UN General Assembly the other day against the people of Ukraine and freedom-loving people around the world. So, Mr. President, I hope that we will support this resolution. I hope we will ensure that we can develop our clean energy sources. That will produce more energy supply for the American people and help lower prices. I know back in May of last year, candidate Trump told the big CEOs that not only was going to help them develop more, but he was going to help them by hurting their competitors in the renewable energy industry. That is no way to conduct an energy policy for the United States of America. I urge my colleagues to support the resolution.
Mr. President.
The Democratic whip.
Mr. President, it's been almost 6 weeks, maybe a couple days beyond 6 weeks of the new administration of Donald Trump in his second term. It's a lot different than his first term. I was here for that occasion as well. And what we found is unique is a blizzard of executive orders issued by President Trump from the beginning of his administration. Among those executive orders was his declaration of an energy emergency. Energy emergency. Turns out, Mr. President, that that claim is not based on fact. There is no energy emergency in America. Under the Biden administration, we saw record deployment of wind, solar, biofuels, batteries, oil, gas, and nuclear. In fact, the United States is producing more power than ever. And last year, the United States of America produced more oil than any other nation in the history of the world. And yet, President Trump continues to insist that America is on the verge of nationwide blackouts and clean energy will raise prices. Clean energy will raise prices. Simply not true. So what's the reason for the president to try to mislead the American people? The short answer is that he wants to give handouts to his billionaire buddies in the fossil fuel industry. Before Elon Musk showed up with his multi-billion-dollar fortune, it was reported that then candidate Donald Trump invited fossil fuel executives to Mar-a-Lago to ask for, hold on to your seats, a $1 billion campaign contribution. $1 billion bucks. Now that he's in office, President Trump is doing everything he can to keep those billionaires happy. That means tax cuts for the ultra-wealthy, which is on its way, I'm afraid, opening up federal lands and waters for drilling, and yes, declaring this phony energy emergency. Why is he doing it? Declaring an emergency grants the president additional statutory authority. Donald Trump is using these authorities to fast-track pipelines and drilling in the Gulf of Mexico. But there is nothing in this declaration to support fossil fuels' cleanest competitor, wind and solar. If Trump doing the bidding of billionaires wasn't bad enough, his so-called emergency will also raise the electric bills of thousands of families. Wind and solar is the cheapest energy in the world, and those cheap prices get passed on to the families who take advantage of it. I know personally. A few years ago, my wife and I made the decision to install solar panels on the roof of our home. Our home project gave union workers in my community a good-paying job, and it was just one project contributing to hundreds of thousands of jobs created under the Biden administration. Since Democrats' Inflation Reduction Act was enacted 2.5 years ago, more than 1.5 million Americans have installed solar panels. Was it a good idea? Well, I compared the electric bills that I've been receiving in my home before and after the solar panels. Before the solar panels were installed on my roof, the monthly bill was about $115 for electricity. Now it's $15 because of the solar energy. Every one of these installations also helped to create good-paying jobs for electricians, carpenters, and other workers. And supplying those panels created thousands of new jobs at factories around the country. But President Trump is not impressed. He wants to eliminate those jobs. We have an opportunity to undo the harms of one of the President Trump's many lies today. I want to thank Senator Kaine of Virginia for leading this effort. We need to raise up American workers, lower utility bills, and put America back on track to lead the world in clean energy. I urge my colleagues to support the Kaine measure. Mr. President, I'd like to address a separate issue, separate in the congressional record. On January 6, 2021, a solemn constitutional proceeding was disrupted when a mob of thugs, egged on by President Trump, attacked and trashed the U.S. Capitol in an attempt to overturn the results of a presidential election. The grim result of that insurrection was the subsequent death of 5 law enforcement officers and injuries to approximately 140 others, many of whom are still paying the price to this day. It came as a shock when on the first day of Donald Trump's presidency, he issued a blanket pardon for those who had been convicted for that January 6th attack on the Capitol. We all saw the videos, we all saw the photographs. Here's an illustration of one of them. Listen to what President Trump said about 1,600 pardons at a recent press conference when he was asked, why did you pardon all those people who attacked the police officers in the Capitol building? He said, quote, I pardoned people who were assaulted themselves. They were assaulted by our government. They didn't assault. They were assaulted. What I did was a great thing for humanity. The American people overwhelmingly disagree with the president, and they disagree with his decision. 83% of them opposed the pardons that he gave. That includes 70% who lean Republican in their voting. Despite this overwhelming opposition, the Justice Department has now broadened the scope of President Trump's pardons for January 6 rioters to include separate charges stemming from searches conducted during those investigations. I'll describe a couple of them to you. Federal prosecutors recently dropped explosives and firearm crimes being pursued against two January 6 defendants pardoned by President Trump, Daniel Ball and Elias Kostians. Ball and Kostians had both been charged in separate proceedings with illegally possessing weapons that law enforcement discovered during the January 6 related search. Ball had been accused of throwing, quote, an explosive device that detonated upon at least 25 officers during the Capitol riot and of forcefully shoving police who were trying to protect the Capitol. Ball was barred from possessing firearms because of his prior criminal record. Listen to this prior criminal record of a man who was pardoned by Donald Trump. Before January 6, Ball was convicted of domestic violence battery by strangulation, resisting law enforcement with violence, and battery on law enforcement officer. And President Trump says that poor man was assaulted by the police. Does it sound like it? Remember, President Trump told us Ball and his fellow rioters were the actual victims. No wonder so many of the January 6 perpetrators have shown a stunning lack of remorse. Just last Friday, just a few days ago, a number of these pardoned individuals decided to hold their own press conference outside the U.S. Capitol to announce their intent to sue the Justice Department for prosecuting them for this. Dangerous individuals, including former Proud Boy leader Enrique Tarrio, who'd been serving a 22-year sentence for seditious conspiracy before the Trump pardon. Proud Boy Ethan Nardine, who'd been serving an 18-year sentence. Dominic Pizzola, the first rioter to breach the building on January 6. He was serving a 10-year sentence for stealing a police riot shield and using it to break a window. I'll bet you saw that video. I did. The group paraded through the Capitol after their press conference, following the same route they took on January 6, 2021. They posed for photos, chanting as they did that day, quote, "Whose house? Our house." And after the press conference, Mr. Tarrio was even arrested again outside the Capitol for assaulting a female counter-protester. Tarrio also posted a video of himself stalking Michael Fanone and Harry Dunn, former police officers who had defended the Capitol on January 6. Tarrio was following them through the lobby of a hotel where the officers were attending a conference. While Tarrio followed them, he was calling out at them that they were cowards and telling them to keep walking. Does this sound like a man ashamed of his actions on January 6 and full of remorse? Does this sound like an innocent victim of assault? No, this sounds like a man who now thinks he is above the law with his Trump pardon and expects to be bailed out by President Trump for every crime he decides to commit. In another horrifying term, the same hotel that I discussed earlier where these rioters were stalking policemen had to be evacuated after someone claiming to be MAGA emailed a threat about 4 bombs, 2 in the hotel and 1 at Officer Fanone's mother's mailbox. After listing the names of several of the conference attendees and singling out Officer Fanone, the email said they, quote, all deserve to die. These are men and women in police forces who risked their lives for members of the Senate and the House of Representatives on January 6. The perpetrator of this source of this tweet claimed to be acting, quote, to honor the January 6 hostages recently released by Emperor Trump, his words. And these are just last week's updates on the January 6 rioters President Trump pardoned. The list of crimes committed by these thugs just keeps growing longer and longer. We must be clear that these individuals are a threat, and the more power and freedom they're given, the more danger they pose to our democracy, and the law enforcement officers and families of those officers that they are harassing. Just this month, dozens of January 6 offenders joined forces on social media to compile and publicize the identities of at least 124 individuals who had been involved in their convictions, including prosecutors, judges, and FBI agents. The post, which has received 60,000 views, included names, photos, disparaging remarks, and demands for accountability. In January, another pardoned January 6 defendant who pleaded guilty to assaulting police officers, Ryan Nichols Sr., identified in a Twitter post, quote, officers in the D.C. jail who need to be investigated for corruption and abuse, end of quote, adding the names and LinkedIn profile photos of 2 D.C. jail employees. This is stalking and harassment of law enforcement, men and women who were assigned to this Capitol to protect us. The men and women who bravely defended the members of this body deserve better than this, and we should honor them for their heroic efforts on that day, not excuse the rioters who attacked this chamber and the ideals it represents. Government employees should not fear for their safety or that of their families for simply doing their job. I hope that all of us, regardless of our political persuasion, will finally agree on one thing. Violence has no place in a democracy, and Donald Trump's pardon of these 1,600 January 6 attackers is not only an insult to the Capitol Police, who risked their lives to stop them, but has emboldened these convicts to harass these officers and their families. Mr. President, the question for the Senate is simple. Whose side are you on, the police or the rioters? I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Arizona.
Mr. President, I'm going to state the obvious. The United States has real energy needs. We've got to produce enough reliable energy to make utility bills affordable for families and to bring online the advanced manufacturing and data centers that are powering our economy and will power our economy into the future. We're seeing this in Arizona. The demand for energy keeps going up. It's going up rather quickly. Now, here's the good news. The United States is producing more energy than ever before. We're using everything at our disposal. We're finally bringing the manufacturing of solar panels and batteries and wind turbines back to America. Now that creates great paying jobs across the country, jobs that you can actually raise a family on, jobs that are in places like Arizona and Oklahoma, Colorado, and Texas. And we're investing to develop new technologies to produce even more energy. Now, for years, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have raised very legitimate concerns about the need to reform our permitting processes to cut red tape and unleash American manufacturing. Well, Mr. President, here's the bad news. President Trump is now throwing red tape around our energy production, which will raise utility bills and send American manufacturing back overseas. One of his first actions as president, one of the first things he did was to block approvals of new wind projects on federal lands and then freeze loans and freeze grants for clean energy projects. He's making permitting harder or impossible. Mr. President, that's the opposite of what my Republican colleagues, your colleagues, wanted done. Now, he also wants to change the definition of energy to only include fossil fuels. Mr. President, it's 2025. We all need to live in the real world. More than 90%, get this, 90% of new energy production connected to the grid last year was renewable energy. And it takes 3 or 4 years just to build a natural gas power plant. There's no good reason to block wind projects, to block solar projects that, by the way, are already underway to bring more energy to American homes and businesses. President Trump, what he is doing is he's trying to pick winners and losers. When it comes to energy, he wants to decide. And the winners are fossil fuel companies and China. And the losers, Mr. President, the losers, that's everybody else. That's you, that's your family, that's your business. And families especially. Families are going to face higher utility bills. And manufacturers, they're going to lose the support that they were relying on. And workers are just going to see their jobs go back overseas. You think China doesn't want to make more of this stuff and sell it to us? Of course they do. They will be happy to do that, and we will pay the price. They would love to see President Trump drive clean energy manufacturers that are in America out of business. China would want us to cancel our manufacturing plants and cancel these energy projects. Mr. President, we should not let this happen. We've got an opportunity this week to turn this around. So I'm going to be voting for Senator Kaine and Senator Heinrich's effort so that we can focus on our energy future. Now, fortunately, there is so much that we agree on. The need to modernize our power grid, to bring manufacturing back to America, to create jobs and reduce our reliance on imports, and to develop the energy technologies of the future right here in the United States of America, not in another country, not in China. And all of this supports American jobs. And at the same time, it keeps utility bills low for American families. Now, some of it will require us to cut some red tape and make things more predictable and efficient for utilities and for energy producers. Me and many of my colleagues, we have shown that we are willing to work on these reforms on a bipartisan basis. So let's do it. And Mr. President, not you, but the President of the United States, let's reverse these short-sighted, targeted attacks on our energy supply. And if we do that, I know that we can work together and continue to expand the amount of energy this country has at its disposal and bring down the prices for American families and American businesses. Thank you, and I yield the floor.
Senator from Colorado.
President, before I speak on the matter in front of us, I wanted to say that on roll call vote 89, I voted aye. It was my intention to vote no. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that I be permitted to change my vote, since it will not affect the outcome.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you to my colleagues. I want to come down here and talk a little bit about energy with my colleagues in the Senate today. And part of the reason why is that, as you know, Mr. President, others knows, the President of the United States has declared an energy emergency, and he did it on the day he was inaugurated here in the Capitol, on a day when he had lots of comments about the fact that God had saved him so that he would be there to be inaugurated, that this is going to be the greatest moment in American history, and that we had an energy emergency because there was an insufficient production of oil and fossil fuels. And as anybody who reads the newspaper in America knows, and there may not be anybody left who has access to a paper, but I encourage you to do it. It's a lot better than what you're reading on Twitter these days. The United States has actually produced more oil than we ever have produced in our history. In fact, Mr. President, last year, the Biden administration, we produced more oil than any country in the history of humanity. And the same is true for natural gas. The same is true for LNG exports. The United States produces more oil than any other country in the world. We produce more natural gas than any other country in the world. We are the leading exporter of liquefied natural gas, which, by the way, has been incredibly important recently because we have allowed our allies in Europe to get off the Russian oil that they were on and replace that with liquefied natural gas produced by American citizens, exported by American citizens to break the back of Putin's ability to restrain Europe's participation in the war, because we were able to replace half their energy. I'm so glad that we were able to do that. And we are also the world's leading producer of renewable energy as well. And we have seen a huge amount of growth in solar, a huge amount of growth in wind. And I like to think of Colorado as the place that started an awful lot of that. And we are both a producer of fossil fuels and a producer of renewables. And we know it takes everything to drive this economy, but we want to do all of this in a way that's cognizant of the very real climate issues that our globe faces and that our country faces. And the good news for the United States is there is no country in the world that is better positioned to lead the transition of our energy economy in this world than the United States of America. We are the wealthiest country in the world. We have the biggest and most abundant supply of fossil fuels and non-fossil fuels. We are less corrupt than almost any country on the face of the planet, and especially less corrupt than economies that are dominated by petrochemicals and by oil and gas around the world. We are the innovators in the world. We have a commitment to the rule of law. All of that puts us in this incredible position to lead. And I believe 30 years from now or so, we're going to be in a place where we're able to say, not just to the American people, but to the world, that we are net zero from a carbon point of view, and that we were able to get there through American technology and through American leadership and American ingenuity and American exports, that we took a strategic approach, that we had a plan that made sense, and that we captured along the way every molecule that we could find of fugitive methane from oil and gas and from agriculture and from landfills, that we said yes to wind and solar, that we said yes to nuclear and yes to geothermal, that we said yes to investing in emerging technologies like hydrogen, like carbon capture, and like the carbon dioxide removal bill that I have with my friend Lisa Murkowski from Alaska, which just goes to show you can have a bipartisan approach. That we can move to a position of real leadership that can help us create an economy again, that America, when it grows for everybody, not just the people at the very top, because we've got good energy jobs that are concerned with the production of oil and gas and the production of all those other forms of energy. And by the way, just on that point, and I'll be brief here, Mr. President, because I know my colleague from Massachusetts wants to speak, on that subject, this Senate is about to get rid of the common sense methane regulations that were passed in the last administration that are based on the work, that fee based on the work that we had done in Colorado, working with industry, as the last administration did, to create certainty, to create predictability, to send a message to the world that we want American gas to be the cleanest gas of any gas in the world. And having us capture that fugitive methane is a hugely important part of that. We are saying no to that now. We are saying yes to the air pollution that's going to result. We are saying yes to the climate pollution that will result. I say to my colleague from Massachusetts while she's here, I take no pleasure, and the President knows this, from the fact that Donald Trump is our president. I regret that he is our president, but he is our president. And one of the ways he got to be our president is that he was elected twice. And in fact, more people voted for him this time than voted for him the last time. I regret that. I am sorry for that. And I think there are lots of reasons for that. But I think one of the reasons for that is that there is a mythology out there that the Democratic Party believes that we're going to turn fossil fuels off yesterday, or that we're going to turn fossil fuels off next week, or that we don't respect the men and women that work in our energy fields or in our energy processing across the country. If there are Democrats that feel that way, I disagree with them. Because the worst thing we could do at this moment, when we have the energy abundance that we have, when we have the economic freedom we have, when we have the lack of corruption that we have, the worst thing we could do is elect a climate denier to be president whose most creative approach to energy was Sarah Palin's shop-worn drill, baby, drill, which is what he announced under the dome of the United States Capitol the day he was inaugurated president, and said completely untruthfully that we were in an energy crisis, when what we have is an energy abundance and no excuse for not leading the rest of the world in making sure that this transition on net zero carbon is accomplished, and that we do it in a way that protects our economy, that we do it in a way that protects our national security, that we do it in a way that recognizes the contribution that people have made for generations in Northwest Colorado and all over our economy to be able to drive this economy forward. And to the extent that the failure is a failure of the Democratic Party to make clear our position, I want to own that failure and that responsibility. It's not Donald Trump's fault that he was elected. He ran, he won. We own some of the fact that he got elected. And I think on this issue, we have not communicated clearly to the American people what we believe. And as a result of that, once again, our children and grandchildren have a climate denier in the White House, even though a majority of the American people believe that climate change is real and that we should be doing something about it. And those of us that are advocates on this side have to be very clear, much clearer. He said poorly and unclearly, but let me say again, have to be much clearer about what we stand for. which is for a transition that makes sense and that science commands, and for the respect of people that are working in the energy industry, no matter what part of the industry they're working in. And the fact that Donald Trump, even when oil is at $73 a barrel at his inauguration, and we're producing more than we've ever produced in the history of mankind from the United States, thinks we're in an energy emergency, or he claims that we are, surprises me not at all. Since he said he was going to drive prices down, the price of eggs are so high today as we meet here, you need a mortgage practically to buy a dozen eggs in the United States of America. We can do better than that, and we can do better than his drill, baby drill energy policy. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
President.
Senator from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I want to thank the senator from Colorado for your energetic leadership in this area. I'm very grateful for your voice on this and for the work you do for the people of the country and also for everybody around the world. We've got to deal with this problem. So thank you. I rise today in support of Senator Kaine and Senator Heinrich's resolution to terminate Donald Trump's executive order declaring a national energy emergency. I just want to start by being clear about what's going on here. Donald Trump promised to gut our environmental laws if big oil CEOs gave him $1 billion for his campaign. He was quite open about this. How could he do that? Well, he's figured it out. He declared an emergency that he has focused on. That emergency will give him a chance to pay those oil executive CEOs back. Now, this order is not a serious attempt at lowering anyone's energy costs. And you know how I know this? Because a true strategy to lower people's costs would include clean energy sources like wind and solar, which this order deliberately excludes. So, what does this executive order do? It lets big oil and gas companies off the hook on following our environmental laws and regulations. And those are the rules that make sure that you have clean air to breathe and clean water to drink. Why would Donald Trump do this? It is simple. He does not care about lowering anyone's costs or helping create good jobs. All he cares about is his rich as hell, those are his words, his rich as hell donors and helping them make more money. Let's be clear. Energy prices are too high. Americans are feeling those high prices. Energy prices have been on the rise for the past decade. In the last year, 1/3 of Americans have had to cut back on necessary spending in order to pay their energy bills. Americans are looking for real solutions. And that is why Democrats got to work and passed the biggest climate package in the history of the world to unleash American innovation and to support a clean energy future. Now, America is producing more energy than ever before, including through offshore wind projects off the coast of Massachusetts. And we're creating good jobs while we're doing it. Clean energy jobs are now over 40% of all the energy jobs in the United States. They are growing twice as fast as other industries. But Donald Trump is now trying to unravel all of that progress. Why? In order to please his big oil and gas donors. And this sham will have real consequences for our communities, raising energy costs and cutting American jobs. Look no further than Somerset, Massachusetts, to see what is happening. At Brayton Point in Somerset, there's an old coal-fired power plant that closed down years and years ago. But a private company called Prismian has decided that they want to turn part of this plant into a factory to build undersea cables to support American offshore wind farms. They want to build the cables so we can bring that power in and use it, that clean power in, and use it here in the United States. That project would be transformative for Somerset. It would create about 250 to 300 good manufacturing jobs and would deliver more than $10 million in annual tax revenues. That's a big deal for a small town. So, for the last few years, local officials and our Massachusetts federal delegation has been working hard with the federal government to help turn that idea into a reality. Last month, the company suddenly announced they're ending the projects. No more jobs, no more tax revenue. And why? Because of Donald Trump's attacks on clean energy. Somerset's experience is just one of the experiences felt by many communities all around this country. Yes, Somerset will bounce back, but Donald Trump is cutting jobs and raising energy costs on communities all across this country just to please his oil and gas donors. And it's communities like Somerset that are paying the price for that. Make no mistake, we will fight back. That is why Democrats are here today. That fight starts with ending this sham of an executive order. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on Senator Kaine and Senator Heinrich's resolution. And with that, I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Senator from Oregon.
here is the question. Do we pursue the 20th century energy vision featuring dirty, expensive fossil fuels? Or do we pursue the 21st century energy vision featuring inexpensive and clean renewable energy? Trump's energy emergency declaration is about one thing. He's choosing the strategy of dirty, expensive fossil fuels. You know, he asked the powerful big oil companies to contribute $1 billion to his campaign. And now he's paying them back at the expense of the American people. Families lose, billionaires win. The plan features giving fossil fuel companies the power to seize public lands. It features giving fossil fuel companies the power to skip environmental assessments that show how their projects will poison the air, pollute the water, kill wildlife, and despoil our ecosystems. It's the plan of giving fossil fuel companies the power to bypass the public comment period so the public can't weigh in about the terrible ideas the fossil fuel companies are putting forward. So the public can't weigh in about the drilling rigs and the leaky pipelines and the export terminals polluting their communities. This is not government of, by, and for the people. It's government of, by, and for the oil and gas companies. Families lose, billionaires win. This emergency declaration is certainly a sham because renewable energy costs less than fossil fuel energy. The International Renewable Energy Agency found that the cost of new wind or solar is at least 30% cheaper than the cost of running most fossil coal plants. So it's no surprise that in 2024, 94% of the new energy on the grid came from renewables, from harnessing the power of the sun and the wind. Prioritizing expensive fossil fuels over cheap renewables drives up the price of energy that families pay on their bills every month. That's Trumpflation. Exporting more fossil fuels mean families pay more at the pump and they pay more to heat their homes. That's Trumpflation. And burning more fossil fuels intensifies climate chaos and wildfires and hurricanes. It blows the top off the cost of insurance for people's homes as insurers flee the markets. That's Trumpflation. Meanwhile, fossil fuel companies make even bigger profits. Families lose, billionaires win. You know, this is not a red state or a blue state issue. Since August 2022, investments from the Inflation Reduction Act have created more than 400,000 clean energy jobs, with more than half of those jobs in red states. In fact, 19 of the 20 congressional districts at the top for clean energy investments are represented by my colleagues on the Republican side of the aisle. What are the top 3 states overall in clean energy job growth? Idaho, Texas, and New Mexico. 2 out of those 3 states represented by Republicans in this Senate. For wind energy, it's Texas, Iowa, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Illinois. 4 out of 5 states represented in this Senate by Republicans. For solar energy, it's California, Texas, Florida, North Carolina, and Arizona. 3 out of 5 of those states represented by Republicans. So this is not a blue versus red situation. Nearly 3.5 million Americans now work in the clean energy field, more than 1 million of those jobs in red states. And it's estimated that these investments will continue to create hundreds of thousands of jobs across the country. Prioritizing fossil fuels will kill this job growth for working Americans. So this strategy, this energy strategy, this is an energy strategy in which families lose, billionaires win, and there are far fewer good-paying jobs for Americans. And by the way, prioritizing fossil fuels is helpful to China. If we have a national energy emergency, we shouldn't be fueling our competitors by selling our energy to China to make their economy run better. If we have an emergency, we shouldn't cede the future of clean energy and all the jobs it will create and the less expensive energy it creates to China. We would want to make these products here and export them to the world, not have to buy them from China, helping China's economy grow at the expense of our own. This phony national emergency declaration comes down to this. Do we want families to win, or do we want billionaires to win? Let's come together on red states and blue states together, say we want these jobs, we want this clean energy, we want this less expensive energy for Americans, because we are fighting for the families, not for the billionaires. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Senator from Vermont.
You know, there's 2 issues. One is about the policy, the energy policy that the Trump administration is announcing. And we can have a debate about that. I'm in full support of the comments that my colleagues have made. But there's another issue that in many ways is more important. And that issue is whether this United States Senate will accede to relinquishing its authority as a separate and independent branch of government to a president who tries to seize that power by claiming a phony emergency. What justifies this action as far as President Trump is concerned and legally is the assertion that we have an energy emergency. And by invoking that term, he's saying to Congress, get lost. This needs immediate attention that only the executive can give. And getting lost means that we don't act as an independent branch of government and fulfill the constitutional responsibility we have to be separate, independent, and a check and balance on executive power. That is a separate question from whether members agree or disagree with the drill baby drill policy. But it's fundamental to the well-being of our democracy. And Congress in the past has never come close to relinquishing that authority. And whether you're a Democrat or Republican, if you are a United States Senator, you have to defend the institution, not because it's good for me or you or any other member of the Senate, but it's good for America. We rely on that system of checks and balances. So the question is it an emergency? And as my colleagues have laid out, no. We've never had more production of power in our history. We're exporting power. The power situation is not an emergency. There's power abundance. Now, second thing, as many of my colleagues have said, there are real consequences because essentially what the president is doing is going all in on fossil fuels and casting aside the opportunities that come, economic opportunities, as well as cleaner climate opportunities with clean energy. I'm not going to repeat all of the information provided by starting with Senator Kaine, but it's true. And you know, selling out, as some of my colleagues say, to the fossil fuel industry, you know, the president was reported to have said, get me $1 billion. What I don't understand is why you would kill jobs in the clean energy sector that is producing cheaper power in good jobs. There's no justification for an executive or member of Congress doing that. The other final point is that we are having this bizarre debate about whether there's a climate situation caused by carbon emissions. Reality is, we all know it is happening. We're all victimized by these wild weather events. And there's only two explanations that explain the actions of the administration. One is they just favor fossil fuels no matter what. A lot of truth to that. The other is there's a lack of confidence on the administration about the capacity of the American people, the American innovators, the American entrepreneurs to take full advantage of solving the issue of climate change by building out clean energy, by doing efficiency. That really, really works. And you know, a confident person, a confident country doesn't deny problems exist. They acknowledge them, face them squarely, and then solve them. And in the process of doing that, they all end up better when we have a stronger economy as well. So there is no emergency. We must stand first for the separation of powers and the authority of Congress and not allow us to be stripped of that by an executive. And second, we have to have a wise policy that is going to create jobs to be sustainable for our economy and for our future. I yield back.
From Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. President. There is an issue that I have spoken about so often on this floor, and it is one that should concern each and every one of us, and that is the issue of human trafficking and sex trafficking that is happening in this country. And what we have learned is that today in the United States, a child is either bought or sold for sex every 2 minutes. Now think about that, and think about the harm that is happening to children because of this amount of human trafficking and sex trafficking. What we also have learned is that globally, this has turned into a $150 billion a year business. This is something that we also have learned affects every town, city, community in our nation. It is pervasive. In Tennessee, my home state, there were 1,170 reports of human trafficking through November of last year. And that is according to the data we have from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigations. Now, that number was actually down from the number in 2023, which had been 1,432 reports, and that was because of the effort that our Governor, Bill Lee, the Tennessee General Assembly, and the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation made into fighting this human trafficking and trying to bring an end to what truly is modern-day slavery. But unfortunately, what we saw as we looked at the data was that last year's total
of 1,170 was still 62% higher than the number in 2019. So as we have looked at this in recent years, what you have seen is an explosion of human trafficking and sex trafficking in this country. While we know that human trafficking has been a problem over a period of time, the concern is this heinous crime and how it has exploded in the recent past. Now, there are some reasons and some contributing factors to the escalation rate in these numbers. And one of them is during the Biden administration, basically they surrendered our southern border to cartels and gangs and criminals and traffickers. Many of us have been to the border. We saw what was happening on the border during the Biden years, and as a result of the inaction that took place there, every town in this country became a border town, and every state became a border state. And because of the drugs, because of the human trafficking, the sex trafficking, the American people suffered the consequences. Just this month, earlier this month, authorities charged 8 Venezuelan illegal aliens in Middle Tennessee for trafficking women across our border for the purpose of sexual exploitation. That was 8 Venezuelan illegal aliens. After entering our country illegally, the criminals conducted their operation out of Nashville motels between 2022 and 24. And like so many criminal illegals in our country, no surprise, they are tied to the violent gang Tren de Aragua, which has plagued cities across this country with organized crime. All too often, these traffickers target not only vulnerable women, they also target children. According to our TBI data, there were 514 reports of children being sex trafficked in Tennessee in 2024. That is 1 year, 514 reports. That was more than twice the number of reports of adult sex trafficking. The report also notes that there has been an increase in the number of unaccompanied minors who were trafficked into our country and exploited. This should come as no surprise. Under Biden, hundreds of thousands of unaccompanied children have reached our southern border, while many more arrived with adults who falsely claim to be their relatives. Although Biden had a responsibility to place these children with vetted sponsors, his administration obviously did not do that. We have learned that they lost track of more than 320,000 migrant children who face the threat of abuse, trafficking, and sexual exploitation. Thankfully, after 4 years of failure under the Biden administration, President Trump is working to secure our border, to protect our communities, and to bring human trafficking to an end. And there is so much more that Congress can do to support this effort. Last week, I introduced the Bipartisan Gracie Act, which would require the recording of all Child Protective Services interviews with children and adults. Although 60% of child sex trafficking victims in our country have engaged with the foster care system, too often CPS staffers miss the signs of abuse. By recording interviews, we can increase the likelihood that child trafficking victims will be identified and rescued. Last month, I also reintroduced a package of bills that will do much to combat human trafficking. My Save Girls Act would provide states, local governments, and nonprofits with the resources they need to end the trafficking of young women and girls. My National Human Trafficking Database Act, meanwhile, would establish a national human trafficking database at the Department of Justice and incentivize state law enforcement agencies to report their data. To help bring an end to trafficking at the border, I also introduced the Child Trafficking Now Act, which would require a DNA test to determine the relationship between illegal aliens at the border and any accompanying child. Now, Mr. President, it is so important to note, I've introduced this bill before, and I did it because during the Trump administration, there was DNA testing. It was ended during the Biden administration. They said it took too much time. I inquired the amount of time. It took 45 minutes. What we know from the time we did DNA testing, 30% of the children that were DNA tested by border agents shared no relation to the illegal aliens who were falsely representing themselves as family members. I think 45 minutes is worth it to save the life of a child. And my Prince Act, which has been reintroduced, would give Customs and Border Protection the authority to fingerprint non-citizens under the age of 14 to combat the horrific practice called child recycling. Just this week, I also sent a letter to FBI Director Kash Patel and Attorney General Pam Bondi requesting that they release the complete, unredacted flight logs from Jeffrey Epstein's private jet. In addition, I also requested Ghislaine Maxwell's Little Black Book and all video surveillance footage from Epstein's residence in Palm Beach, Florida. After years of stonewalling by former Director Wray, we still do not have all the necessary information regarding Jeffrey Epstein's crime, who his associates were, and who was involved in his global human trafficking, sex trafficking ring. That is information we need if we are going to bring an end to this practice of human trafficking, and also if we are going to bring justice for the women and children that were abused and trafficked during these human trafficking and sex trafficking rings. It is past time to bring this practice to an end. With these efforts, we can provide this administration with the tools they need in order to bring an end to this practice.
Mr. President.
Senator from Oregon.
Mr. President, first of all, I want to thank Senator Kaine for his extraordinary leadership on this, because I think America is at a crucial time on energy policy, and Senator Kaine cuts right to the heart of the debate. Donald Trump wants more tax cuts for the ultra-wealthy, and he is willing to pay for those tax cuts by raising your energy bill. And here's how the flawed idea goes down. Clean energy today is plentiful. Clean energy today is cheap. Clean energy today is generating thousands of good-paying jobs. I was involved deeply in writing the law, developed the law that created the Clean Energy Tax Credit package, and it is making progress in communities across the country. What Donald Trump is talking about doing, and Senator Kaine has spelled this out, is defying the reality at the marketplace. For example, we are seeing constantly people in the fossil fuel business saying that this isn't time for drill, baby, drill. They've been very blunt about saying that that doesn't make sense from a marketplace standpoint. What we want to do as it relates to a role for clean energy is build on the progress we've made, make sure clean energy is part of an all-of-the-above program, technologically neutral, competing in a marketplace of choices. Under the Kane legislation, we can have that reality and not the flawed idea that we would somehow benefit from having more tax cuts for the ultra-wealthy and somehow that'll take care of people's energy situation. It won't. If you go with tax breaks for the ultra-wealthy and this program that is based on drill, baby, drill, it's going to create rising energy costs for working families across the land. I urge my colleagues to support the Kane proposal. I yield back.
The senator from West Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today in support of my friend from North Dakota, Senator Hovind's Congressional Review Act resolution to block the implementation of the Biden administration's waste emissions charge, otherwise known as the natural gas tax. Since the day this regulation was finalized last November, I pledged that I would work with President Trump and my colleagues in the Congress to repeal this misguided anti-energy tax. Today in the Senate, that is exactly what we're working to do. We must recognize that we are in a critical moment for American energy. The North American Energy Reliability Corporation has found that over the next 10 years, due to a rise in energy consumption and the early retirement of our existing fossil fuel generation, our country could face major electric generation and reliability concerns. We must take action now to ensure that our future demand is met, that the lights remain on, our homes remain warm, and our economy keeps moving for Americans all across this country. We can do this by continuing to invest in natural gas. Over 60% of American homes every day heat their homes, their water, or their food with natural gas. Natural gas is responsible for over 40% of the electricity generation and fuels more than half of our industrial sector's process heat. While the natural gas tax fails to recognize this reality, let's look at what is true. Fracking and shale gas have both revolutionized and transformed American energy, leading to lower prices, job growth, and increased American energy security. According to the Energy Information Administration, the rapid expansion of natural gas-fired power plants in this country has decreased the power sector's carbon dioxide emissions by 35% over the last 25 years. Natural gas has the potential to further reduce American greenhouse gas emissions if we continue to increase production. Natural gas is affordable, reliable, and a clean source of energy vital to our country and our economy. We should be expanding natural gas production, not restricting it. Instead, the natural gas tax will constrain American natural gas production, leading to increased energy prices and providing a boost to the production of natural gas in Russia. Simply put, repealing the natural gas tax is a win for our economy, a win for our national security, and a win for our environment. As part of establishing this tax, the Democrats' so-called Inflation Reduction Act ordered the EPA to revise its Subpart W requirements in order to facilitate the reporting and calculation of the tax. The EPA's Subpart W revisions blatantly disregard and overstep even the partisan mandates of the IRA and would excessively increase the tax burden on American energy under this natural gas tax. The revised emission factors with its Subpart W reporting requirements make broad assumptions about oil and gas operations and technologies that will lead to inaccurate reporting for many owners and operators. The rule would not only radically expand the scope of emissions required to be reported by each facility under the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program, but it also excessively expands the number of facilities that are covered by Subpart W and consequently responsible to pay the natural gas tax. Due to this uninformed and artificial overestimate of U.S. methane emissions, some smaller operators who were once below the waste emissions threshold are now at risk of seeing their reported methane emissions inflated and owe large sums under the natural gas tax. If not repealed, this rule will arbitrarily increase the cost and burden of reporting under Subpart W, motivated by the Democrats' interest in growing the revenues generated by their natural gas tax. This will make it even more difficult and expensive to produce, transport, and consume American natural gas, and in turn will hurt both American families who rely on the energy and environment and the environment on the communities that we live. It's important that we note that our efforts today works in tandem with this chamber's recently passed budget resolution. As chairman of the Environment and Public Works Committee, I have long intended to stop the natural gas tax, and we will continue to pursue this through the reconciliation process. Today's vote on the CRA provides all senators the opportunity to put our vote on record after witnessing the Biden EPA's bait and switch on the implementation of this misguided policy. I encourage my colleagues to support the CRA that is central to our mission of American energy dominance and reject this tax that will bolster our adversaries, increase energy costs on American families, and put our energy future at risk. And I would like to yield back, but before I do that, I would like to thank my colleague from Iowa for letting me step in front of her to make my speech, and I appreciate that, and I know she will be supporting this. Thank you.
Mr. President. Senator from Iowa.
Mr. President, thank you so much. For over a decade, I've led the charge to expose government abuses, curb reckless regulations, and protect hardworking taxpayers from Washington's overreach. As my colleagues have so rightly discussed, the very actions by the Biden administration made it necessary for President Trump to declare a national energy emergency on day one. The Biden green energy programs artificially incentivized electric vehicles using billions of taxpayer dollars with only 60 charging stations to show for it. And folks, that's just one of the many energy-related billion-dollar boondoggles by the former administration. As chair and founder of the Senate DOJ caucus, I've committed to preventing unchecked bureaucrats from issuing regulations that impose significant new costs and stifle growth. Every day, DOJ is uncovering just how far the Biden administration went to conceal its reckless spending through the federal agencies, especially regarding their climate pet projects. Instead of transparency and objective analysis, Biden's bureaucrats relied on manipulation, inflated so-called net benefits, and completely disregarded economic reality in their rulemakings. And they were prolific, churning out nearly 110,000 pages of regulations just last year. That's 1 year, 110,000 pages, the highest number ever. Between November 2023 and January 2025 alone, agencies issued 50 final rules using shady accounting gimmicks, slapping over $500 billion in regulatory burdens onto hardworking Americans. This included a relentless push to regulate truckers out of business, based on the audacious claim that its extreme emissions rules would somehow create $99 billion in benefits for society. But here's the reality, folks. These policies make everything more expensive for families. They kill jobs, and they hurt our small businesses. And it doesn't stop there. The Department of Energy cited billions in so-called climate net benefits and the social cost of greenhouse gases to justify heavy-handed mandates, ignoring the very real costs passed on to farmers and manufacturers. For too long, unelected bureaucrats have ignored the voices of job creators and working families, pushing costly regulations while hiding the true impact. This is why my Red Tape Act is critical. My bill ensures agencies can no longer manipulate a cost-benefit analysis to push their own agenda. It requires agencies to prioritize data-driven, measurable economic benefits, not vague ideological justifications. And while some federal employees complain about the new directives from the Trump administration, they should take a moment to understand that hardworking Americans who have had to show up to work and take risks to open businesses will no longer tolerate having to foot the bill for regulatory overreach. I am voting no on this effort to end President Trump's national energy emergency. I support the president's efforts to make energy more available and affordable to power economic growth. And with that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
The Democrat leader.
I want to thank Senators Kaine and Heinrich for introducing this resolution and for taking the floor to highlight Donald Trump's energy emergency gimmick. We Democrats are using every tool available to expose Republican hypocrisy, revealing the so-called energy emergency for what it is. It is a shameless power grab by Republicans to pay obeisance to big oil, plain and simple, nothing more but nothing less. Republicans are raising prices by excluding clean energy from their emergency, meaning families could see electricity bills go up by $500 a year. Republicans are killing jobs by gutting domestic energy investments that we made that have created so many new good-paying jobs. Republicans are rewarding China by weakening our economic competitiveness and ceding American energy leadership to our adversaries. The hypocrisy is simple. On the one hand, they say we need more energy for AI, for everything else. But then on the other hand, they greatly curtail the cheapest form of electricity we could make, which is solar, and then wind. Because really what they're doing is just hugging big oil, because big oil hates clean energy, because they know clean energy eventually means the great reduction of polluting oil and gas and what they put into our atmosphere. Senators Kaine, Heinrich, and all Democrats will continue to shine a spotlight on Republican attacks on domestic energy in the weeks and months ahead, and I yield the floor.
I recognize the senator from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. President. To begin, I ask unanimous consent to grant floor privileges to Christopher Creech for today, February 26, 2025.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise to conclude the debate. I believe the vote will follow these remarks. I want to thank my colleagues. 17 Democrats appeared on the floor to speak on behalf of this Senate Joint Resolution 10. I needn't repeat the comments I made at the beginning. I will be very brief. Number one, there is no energy emergency. We've established the United States is producing more energy, more oil, more gas, more renewable energy than at any time in the history of this country, and that we are now a dramatic net energy surplus nation, producing more and more energy than we consume every year. And that surplus is great because we can export to develop, both reducing the trade deficit and helping other nations wean themselves off reliance on petrodictators. Second, President Trump's energy emergency declaration is a sham. He ignores the facts of America's energy dominance in order to benefit big oil, because he told him he would do that last summer. He said, if you support me for president and invest in me, I will give you rollbacks in environmental laws on day one of my administration, and that's precisely what he did. We can tell that that's what he's doing by reading the exact terms of the energy emergency, in which he sidelines critical environmental laws so long as you're producing oil and gas, but not if you're producing wind and solar. If the president really wanted to accelerate energy, he would not leave out wind and solar. Instead, he's doing the bidding of big oil by trying to kneecap wind and solar in his energy emergency declaration. But it's more than the words on the page in the declaration, it's also in his actions. I have many projects in Virginia that have announced with great fanfare, including announced by our Republican governor, that have relied upon tax credits provided in the Inflation Reduction Act or other incentives in the bipartisan infrastructure law. These are projects all over Virginia, rural areas, urban areas, creating big jobs to create clean energy that will bring prices down. President Trump has undertaken a series of actions to put in jeopardy all these projects in Virginia, to jeopardize the jobs and to jeopardize the energy that would be produced that would lower costs. And he's done the same thing in every state in this country. And so we need to reject this energy emergency so that we can have a true energy innovation economy and bring prices down for everyday consumers. I've listened to the comments of my Republican colleagues as they have argued against my Senate Joint Resolution 10, and they basically made two arguments. The first is the argument that they don't believe renewable energy is reliable. And so for that reason, they justify the president leaving out renewable energy sources in his energy emergency order. To the contrary, 94% of the power that's been added to the American electricity grid in 2024 is wind, solar, and battery. Colleagues may stand on the floor and mouth the word that renewable energy is not reliable, but let's look at what the market is doing. And the market is investing in these energies because they are reliable, they are American, they are clean, and they are cheap. And I would venture to say that those investing in these sources are more experts about what's reliable and what's not than members of this body, with all respect. The second argument that's being made by my colleagues is that they support all of the above energy, and they use that to argue against Senate Joint Resolution 10. My Senate Joint Resolution 10 is about all of the above energy, and it's against the notion of leaving out wind, solar, and battery technologies that are driving our green energy economy. The question is, if you're not opposing really because of reliability concerns and you're not really advocating for all of the above, what's the real source of the opposition? The real source of the opposition is this. People do not want to stand up against Donald Trump. They don't want to stand up against a president who declares a fake emergency. They don't want to stand up against a president who is unplugging jobs in their states. They don't want to stand up against a president whose actions will lead to increased energy costs for consumers. They don't want to stand up for a president that is targeting and reversing investments that they even voted for when they voted for the bipartisan infrastructure law. At some point, my question to my colleagues is, when will you stand up? How much do prices have to go up on everyday Americans before you'll stand up? How many jobs do you have to lose in your state before you're going to stand up? How many end runs of congressional statutes will you allow a president to take and be voiceless before you stand up? That's what this is about. I urge my colleagues, stand up for an American innovation energy economy. Don't let President Trump use a fake energy emergency to kneecap it. With that, Mr. President, I yield, and I yield to my colleague from Massachusetts.
I thank my great friend from the state of Virginia. I thank him for his leadership on this. I thank him for bringing out this very important subject, because Mr. President, the American people are being robbed by the fossil fuel industry in broad daylight, and the Trump administration is driving the getaway car. As the senator from Virginia just said, in the United States, in 2024, 94% of all new electrical generating capacity installed is wind and solar and battery technology. 94%. And what I'm hearing on Fox News, what I hear from the not all of the above, but oil above all crowd, is, oh my God, it's terrible what's happening in our country. Look at the war that's being declared upon oil and gas and coal. Saying that wind and solar and batteries are a war against oil and gas and coal is like saying that the cell phone was a war against the black rotary dial phone. It's not a war. It's entrepreneurial, innovative spirit in our country, coming up with new technologies, new ways to solve the problem. And just like, by the way, the black rotary dial industry, they didn't like it. They didn't like it at all. They had a monopoly. But there's a way to get around it. There was a way to have out in the marketplace new ways of generating communications technologies. And now there's new ways of generating electricity. New ways. They hate it. The incumbents hate it. They hate it because they had a bottleneck. It can only be them. It can only be oil, gas, coal. And all of a sudden, a new generation of young people arrive, and they say, no, climate change is threatening this planet. And there's new, innovative ways that we can move. And so, what's at the bottom of all this? The oil, gas, and coal industry are scared. They're petrified the same way the black rotary dial phone industry, the same way that the horse and buggy manufacturer was scared. There's an automobile. There's an automobile now. Oh no, what am I going to do? How about getting in the transportation business, not the horse and buggy industry? How about thinking about becoming maybe an auto dealer in Ohio? How about moving on rather than being a horse and buggy company? Yeah, no, we're stopping that. We're stopping. There's not going to be any roads. We're not going to build any roads out there for automobiles. That would be terrible. So that's what we have. We have right now, we have a war against innovation, a war against non-polluting sources of electricity, a war against a generation of young Americans who are saying the planet is dangerously warming and there are no emergency rooms for planets. $300 billion worth of damage in two storms, Hurricane Milton, Hurricane Helene. $250 billion worth of damage, the fires of LA. That's $550 billion worth of damage in just 3 incidents. That's just the tip of the iceberg of what's coming. And so what the young generation is saying is, can we please install wind and solar and batteries, all electric vehicles? Can we be smart? Can we think ahead? Can we have a generational response? And what's happening is the oil, gas, and coal industry are just calling in their chips. They're just saying that they want to kill everything, kill innovation. And by the way, I was the chairman of the Telecommunications Committee in the 1990s, when we were still in that old era. Believe me, those old companies loved their monopolies. So there's 3 wires that go into people's homes: the cable wire, the telephone wire, the electricity wire. So now we're on the 3rd wire, that electricity wire. Are we going to make that competitive too or not? And they are petrified. And just today, this is unbelievable, the Trump administration announced that he wants to lay off 65% of the Environmental Protection Agency staff. Those are our frontline fighters who ensure our water is safe, our air is clean, our land is not polluted with toxins and chemicals. They want to turn EPA into every polluter's ally. That's their goal. That's what they want to have. That's not what the younger generation wants in our country. And the EPA administrator, Lee Zeldin, also told the White House that he wants to get rid of the EPA's authority to regulate dangerous greenhouse gases based on the threat they pose to public health or welfare. It's known as the endangerment finding. Does greenhouse gas emissions cause warming that endangers the coastlines, endangers cities like LA, leads to $300 billion storms just ravaging through states? And you know what the Supreme Court decided? 5-4, April of 2007, the Supreme Court said, you must determine whether or not there's an endangerment, EPA. And EPA, if you make that determination that it is an endangerment, you then have to do something about it. That's what's ticking them off. Now, I will tell you, in a footnote in his dissent, Justice Scalia said, in voting no, Justice Scalia said, what's next? The regulation of flatulence from cows? Where are they going with all this craziness? You know where we're going? You know where we went? We went to 94% of all new electrical generation capacity in the United States in 2024 is wind and solar and battery technology. That's where we went because there was an endangerment, because you knew what was happening. And by the way, even the IRA that was passed just in 2022, it's already unleashed $400 billion of public and private investment. It's created 400,000 new jobs, 400,000 new jobs in the clean energy sector. Oil, gas, and coal are petrified. They're the black rotary dial phone of 2025. They can see what's happening. It's change. It's a brand new era. It's almost as though somehow or other they've found enough allies here to lock us into the past, to lock us into the 19th century, lock us into the 20th century. Kids don't want to go backwards. They don't want to look at the world in a rearview mirror. They want to look ahead at a brighter, better, safer, cleaner future. And that's what's going on. It's threatening the business model of all of these people. So I directly questioned Lee Zeldin on this exact issue in his hearing before the Environment and Public Works Committee, because I knew he wouldn't have the courage or the ability to stand up to the demands of Trump's big oil and big gas and big coal donors, because if these donors tell Zeldin to wipe any policy meant to protect public health and the planet off the books, it seems he's ready to take out an eraser and to hop to it, regardless of the science, regardless of the law, regardless of the well-being of the American people in the long run, especially young people. The Green New Deal generation, they want change. They want action. They want to move the same way we moved from a black rotary dial phone to this. Only took 20 years. Would have seemed impossible to a black rotary dial phone manufacturer. But it happened because you trusted young people to do the work. And what else is Trump doing for his fossil fuel friends? He's taking their money while he costs you your money. Trump's billionaire oil and gas donors promised him $1 billion last April in a meeting if Trump would take all of the clean energy incentives off of the books. $1 billion. This is all pay to play. And they raised the money for him. And he delivered a sham energy emergency executive order that is already forcing working families to pay more in order to line the pockets of those big oil, big gas, big coal donors. This emergency is a lie. The United States is already the world's largest oil and gas producer. It's the largest exporter of LNG in the world. It's a lie, it's a lie, it's a lie. Everything Donald Trump says about an energy emergency is a lie to the American people, because he has to lie to cover up the fact that oil and gas production is up, but they're so greedy, they want this body and the EPA to kill wind and solar, battery storage technologies, all electric vehicles. That's how greedy they are. It's not enough that they have their largest production capacity in history, because this is really an excuse for Trump and Musk to rig the rules for big oil so they can produce the dirty energy, more easily seize Americans' lands, and pollute the air and water. They want to go on public land now to drill for oil and gas, even though we don't need it. We don't need it. There's a revolution that if we just let it unfold, it would be 94% next year, 94% the next year. What they're afraid of is 10 years from now when everyone says, oh, I love this new world we're living in, the non-polluting, non-greenhouse gas world of renewable energy. So the real emergency, the real crisis, is the climate crisis itself, which continues to turbocharge extreme weather. It's costing lives, billions in damages, sky-high energy bills. insurance rates out of control in all these states that are having these superstorms and fires, and yet Trump is dismantling programs that reduce energy prices, lower heating bills, keep our air and water clean, and create jobs while trying to ram through the dirty energy projects that will do just the opposite. And what does he want to do? He wants to take out a chainsaw. That's what he wants to do. He's taking out his chainsaw. And he wants to call this waste, fraud, and corruption a revolution that creates this incredible economic revolution.
The time for the proponents has
just
expired.
chop all of those programs down at the knees. So we're going to fight it every single step of the way. I thank Senator Kaine. I thank Senator Heinrich for giving us this time on the floor to be able to explain to the American people what's going on.
The senator from North Dakota.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm pleased to come to the floor again today to discuss my resolution to block the Democrats' natural gas tax, which I'll call up right after we vote to affirm President Trump's national energy emergency declaration. The Biden administration's tax and regulatory onslaught over the past 4 years have driven up the cost of energy and led to a national energy emergency for our nation. One of the most egregious examples is a new tax on natural gas, and that's why I'm leading Senate Joint Resolution 12, a Congressional Review Act resolution to block this tax from taking effect. My resolution will rescind the rule implementing the Democrats' natural gas tax that the Biden administration finalized late last year. Congressional Democrats and President Biden mandated this new tax under the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which was, of course, the Inflation Acceleration Act, taking inflation all the way up to 9%. The Environmental Protection Agency issued its final implementing rule on November 18 of last year. The EPA's natural gas tax rule imposes stringent methane emissions charges on qualified petroleum and natural gas infrastructure, starting at $900 a ton for emissions in 24. It then goes up to $1,200 and then ultimately up to $1,500 per ton in 26 and subsequent years. Unless overturned, this will be the first time the federal government has ever imposed a direct tax on emissions. This new charge can equate to an effective tax increase on natural gas on top of other taxes of more than 5%. This will have a disproportionate impact on small oil and gas producers in my home state of North Dakota and across the country, many of which already operate on thin margins and cannot afford the high cost to comply with this onerous rule. Simply put, this is a punitive tax that will be passed along to consumers and will force energy developers to shut in production. That means higher prices to heat your homes. That means higher prices to cook your food. That means higher cost of natural gas for all consumers. Also, less supply of domestic energy means higher gas bills for consumers and an increased reliance on energy imports. Instead of new taxes and regulations designed to stifle production, we should be supporting innovation to maximize the use of our abundant and affordable oil and gas reserves. Our energy producers utilize the latest and the greatest technology, enabling more energy production with the best environmental stewardship. Today, the U.S. is the world's largest oil and gas producer, and at the same time, we've also led the world in emission reductions. Since 1990, U.S. natural gas production has doubled. This is an interesting stat. Since 1990, U.S. natural gas production has doubled, yet at the same time, we've reduced total emissions by 20%. Double the output, 20% reduction in emissions. We've been able to increase crude oil production by 60% over the same time period. When I was governor of North Dakota in 2000, our state was producing less than 100,000 barrels a day. We took that up to 1.5 million barrels of oil a day. This doesn't just happen overnight. It's because we work to provide the regulatory certainty to empower innovation and entrepreneurial spirit to unlock the potential for energy development in our state and in our country. As North Dakota became an energy powerhouse, our state producers have worked hard to meet the challenges of managing growing volumes of natural gas associated with oil production. North Dakota producers have endeavored to dramatically increase the targeted gas capture rate from 74% to 95% over the past 10 years. Again, through innovation, through technology, the latest, greatest methods that we've implemented. Producers want to improve on that rate, and we continue to, but the Biden administration and its Green New Deal allies tried to make it, and in fact did make it harder, to permit the very gathering systems that we needed to capture that natural gas. So they impeded our ability to reduce emissions. Instead of supporting more gathering lines and interstate production, the Biden administration's natural gas tax will hinder domestic production. Further, because our nation generates over 40% of our electricity from natural gas, burdensome taxes on natural gas producers will result in more expensive and less reliable electricity. More inflation for consumers across the country as a result. Also, less production at home makes other nations and our allies abroad more dependent on adversarial nations that have no regard for environmental standards. Think Russia, think Venezuela, think OPEC. At the end of the day, energy security directly impacts our economic and national security. This is about taking the handcuffs off and empowering our energy producers to increase supply and bring down prices for American families and businesses. That's why we're working to roll back the Biden administration's disastrous policies on energy like this natural gas tax. I want to thank EPW Chairman Capito and the 25 other co-sponsors of my resolution, and I urge all of my colleagues to support this Congressional Review Act resolution. I look forward to continue to work with my colleagues and the Trump administration to repeal this misguided tax on natural gas while increasing energy production across the board in this country with good environmental stewardship that will truly make America energy dominant once again. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
I yield back all remaining time.
All time is yielded back. The clerk will read the title of the resolution for the third time.
SJ Res 10, Joint Resolution terminating the national emergency declared with respect to energy.
The question occurs on passage of joint resolution. Is there sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Banks, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Ms. Blunt Rochester, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Britt.